Hi, everyone. This is Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute of Politics. Welcome to our next session of our virtual post-election conference. We're very happy to have as our guest, Mr. Jeff Greenfield. Jeff is an author and journalist and worked as an analyst, a political analyst for CBS, CNN, and ABC. Still does a little work for PBS. Jeff, it's great to have you here with us today.
Nice to be in the heartland. You know, I grew up in Manhattan and I live in Santa Barbara, and we're not exactly in touch with what you might call the salt of the earth. It's nice to talk to somebody from the heartland.
Yeah, very good. Well, let's start with a little background on your upbringing, your education, and how you got into politics.
I was born and raised in New York City, a child of the public schools, and I got hooked on politics at an unseemly early age of 9. It was 1952. I was spending the summer up in my grandfather's cottage, and I would listen to the Yankee game every day on the radio. We didn't have a TV. And one day my mom said, no Yankee game today. I got to listen to the Republican convention. Okay. Now, as it turns out, the 1952 Republican convention was one of the most contentious street brawls in history. And I didn't know what was on. I just knew this was pretty cool. So much so that when the Democrats met, I said to my mom, will you make sure you let me know who wins when I wake up in the morning? I demanded the right to stay up late on election night, although Eisenhower had won so early, I went to sleep early. But from then on, politics, that and baseball were the two passions. I've indeed found that a lot of people in my generation who were hooked on baseball early also were hooked on politics. I can't explain it. Went to the University of Wisconsin, went to Yale Law School, wound up through a fortuitous set of circumstances working in Bobby Kennedy's office the last year of his life and on the campaign. And after a stint with John Lindsay in New York City Hall, I went to work with a political analyst, a political media guy named Dave Garth, who was kind of a pioneer of what we now see as common. And I divided my time between working with him and writing. And I finally realized you can't serve two masters. At least I couldn't. I couldn't spend half my time working in politics. Now I have to do an honest analysis. So I bailed out of the consulting work and just started freelancing. When by accident on CBS, they decided I should help conventions in 1980, and I was all running. I just, looked up a few decades later, and there I was.
As you said, David Garth was kind of one of the very first political consultants, I guess, with people like Stu Spencer and Bill Roberts out in California. Talk a little bit about Garth and how he worked and kind of what he did.
He wasn't a pioneer, but it was certainly early. I met him when I was working for John Lindsay and he was doing Lindsay's media. And when I left Lindsay, he said, why don't you come work with me part-time? I'll give you time to write. Garth was a fire plug of a guy. He was a very kind of combative, he smoked thin, really odoriferous cigars. Alan Garfield sort of played Dave Garth in the movie The Candidate. But Dave also did things that I think were strikingly different from what I see now. For instance, we had on his staff a woman whose job was to fact check us, and she had veto power. And if we did an ad that she thought, no, that's not honest, we didn't run it. I'm not sure too many media guys these days have fact checkers. The other thing Dave believed was in kind of assaulting the viewer with facts, because his argument was people would see the ad any number of times, and he wanted them to take something away from it. So on what we call the lower third supers, the graphics that run on the bottom of the screen, there were just facts after facts after facts. And again, I would say that not too many ads that I see today are overwhelmed by facts. So even though he was a combatant, and listening to Dave talk to a reporter on the phone was really an exercise in learning new meanings of Anglo-Saxon phrases, he had a commitment to a certain kind of bedrock level of, I would argue, of honesty, even in political commercials. That I was very comfortable working with him. We didn't have any fights about, you can't say that, that's not true. And I realize I sound like, you know, one of the dinosaurs blinking in the sun, but when I look at TV commercials today, I don't see a lot of that commitment, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I think that's a very diplomatic and mild way to put that, Jeff. Thank you very much. Now, as I mentioned, you worked for actually, I guess, four of the networks as a political analyst. Talk a little bit about your work and some of the interesting things that have happened to you in those roles.
Well, in 1980, at the very last minute, CBS said, you know, we want you to go to the convention and do analysis with Bill Moyers and James Kilpatrick. We want somebody a little younger, and to me, that was like being invited to play center field for the New York Yankees. I never dreamed of growing up to be president, but the idea of being able to talk about politics to an audience and get paid for it was pretty much I wouldn't say a goal, but an aspiration. And that's what I really spent the next 30 years doing. I didn't do commentary. It wasn't like 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. And I didn't do straight reporting. It was an attempt to take what I thought I knew about politics and history and cover campaigns that way. I used to say that I didn't tell people what to think, but I tried to tell them what to think about. And that took me, well, you can imagine what it took me. It took me through the Reagan campaign. It took me through the next 30 years of presidential campaigns, through the Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton affair, through 9/11. And now that I'm not doing it full time, but I write for Politico and I do analysis for PBS on the weekends, took me through this rather unusual 4 years that we've lived through with the ascension of Donald Trump, who in some sense violated almost everything that we, quote, experts thought we understood about politics, and yet in a broader or deeper sense did connect with some strains in political life that it just took some doing to kind of figure out how this guy who didn't look anything like what the model of a presidential candidate should be could pull this off. And as we're seeing now, his imminent departure is not exactly fitting the normal way that defeated candidates concede and move on. I also tried to bring in my affection for pop culture. There are some, for instance, when Bill Clinton was elected, and it looked to me like the same insiders, despite his campaign, were getting positions of power. The quote that I used was from The Who: "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." And there are many campaigns where the Grateful Dead's line from Truckin', "What a long, strange trip it's been." I mean, you could just say that about Donald Trump and you almost don't have to say much more. So that was my approach. I didn't have the kind of charisma, the jut-jawed charisma of an anchor. So I tried to use TV to be very conversational. When I didn't know something, I could make a living out of this for years and see it. And they'd say, "Well, does this mean that the campaign is over?" And I'd say, "I actually don't think so. Maybe we should wait a while. Maybe we should let a few people vote before we decide who the nominee is." I tried to bring a certain sense of, not exactly detachment, but the way I would talk to you if we were sitting over a beer, somewhere, rather than the Olympian way that a network anchor and analyst would try to impress people, because I couldn't do that.
Right. Well, that's a fascinating observation, and the popular cultural references are really great. Let's kind of move forward into this campaign. You mentioned the president. Kind of give me an assessment, what you thought were his chances in late February, before South Carolina and before the pandemic. It looked like maybe Senator Sanders could be the Democratic nominee. It looked like the economy was just booming and going strong. What was your assessment of the president's reelection chances at that point in time?
Well, here's one of the weirdest things about this whole year, which is if you looked at the matchups back in February, in fact, before that, November of 2019, between Biden and Trump, throughout the entire campaign, if you took the averages, not some of the more outlier polls, nothing changed. The result that Biden won by in the popular vote was about where he was a year ago. So if you'd been Rip Van Winkle and fallen asleep, say, after New Year's Eve, had a little too much to drink and went to sleep for 11 months and woke up after Election Day, you would have assumed nothing happened. Not the pandemic, not the wholesale upsetting of the economy. You would have said, oh, I guess it's a kind of really dull and interesting election year. Which tells you a couple of things for me. One, contrary to what a lot of us thought, the pandemic turns out to have had less impact on the outcome than a lot of us thought. In fact, not that exit polls are necessarily totally trustworthy, but if you believe them, the economy was what more people voted on than the pandemic or the upheaval in race relations after the killing of George Floyd. And so what it suggested was the two fundamental things. One, this wasn't going to be a landslide. And second, given what happened to the Republicans down ballot, this looks very much like what began in 2020 as the central point ended, which is too many people did not like Donald Trump as president to get him reelected. I think he's the first president in possibly ever to never hit 50% job approval, ever in his campaign. And as I say, when you look at what happened down ballot, I mean, there were all these Senate races, including in Kansas, where the Democratic candidate was outspending the Republican in some states by tens of millions of dollars. They were all these Republican incumbents and open seats were in jeopardy. And in fact, the net gain was 1. That tells me, by the way, that party preference has now become way more significant as an indicator of voting than it used to be. That is, if you take the last 2 presidential years, only one senator won in a state where the other party's presidential candidate won. That was Susan Collins this time around. It was an absolute indicator. And so, as I say, I think it was contrary to what Democrats had hoped. It was a pretty good year for Republicans. Certainly, in the state legislatures, they dominated. Even though the Democrats said, well, we're not going to make the mistake we made 10 years ago. We're really going to fight. They didn't pick up anything. Their House majority as of now, until they get 2 special elections to replace Richmond and Fudge, they're down to 220. They're that close to losing their their House majority. And given what we know about midterms, you would not put a lot of money on the Democrats staying in the House. So what I'm saying, I don't mean to go on at great length, but it fundamentally was, I think, what it would have been had there been no pandemic. I know a lot of Republicans or Trump supporters think if it wasn't for the pandemic, we would have won. Well, he was behind Biden a year ago. But I can't replay 20 alternate histories, even though I've written a few of them, and say, well, here's what would have happened without the pandemic. But I think that's the best I can make of where we are.
One of the things, Jeff, that I found fascinating about this election cycle was how on the Democratic side, after New Hampshire and Iowa, a lot of pundits just wrote Joe Biden off. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, he's got the African-American strength in South Carolina. He's still polling well in national polls. Why did so many people have that wrong?
I think you're talking about one of the cardinal sins of political analysis, which I have called premature evaluation. Yes, yeah, it's quite deliberately chosen that way. Because people look at one event and they project endless consequences. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Biden was invisible in Iowa, invisible in New Hampshire. He couldn't draw a crowd big enough to fill a phone booth, if they still have phone booths somewhere. He had no money. And as I remember, just after the Nevada caucuses, the question was, well, on Super Tuesday, would Bernie Sanders have enough delegates to be a commanding front runner, or, and this happens every 4 years, as you know. Is this the year of the brokered contested convention? Will we go to a second or third ballot, which a lot of us have never had the privilege of covering? And so what happens? So Jim Clyburn endorses Biden in the South Carolina primary. The Saturday before Super Tuesday, Biden wins a big victory there. Within 48 hours, several of his opponents drop out and endorse him. And 100 hours later, after he's been left for dead, he's the putative nominee. Now, I don't know how many times people like me, I like to think that I'm relatively immune to this, but I'm probably kidding myself. I don't know how many election cycles we have to go through when the assertions of one day are completely upended the next, before people say, we don't know yet. It's like you get kicked out of the business if you say, I don't know. Because why don't we wait? That's what I was saying earlier. Why don't we wait and see what happens? I can't predict the future. But once people have voted in the Super Tuesday states, maybe we'll all have a better idea of what's happening. And it was astonishing. Biden won on Super Tuesday. He won in states he never visited, where he hadn't put up a single commercial. It was just that the party as a whole, and people were pointing this out earlier, the Democratic Party is not the Twitter Democratic Party. You know, whatever you follow on Twitter with the more excitable folks, there are several million people who are not on Twitter, but who vote in Democratic primaries. And it turns out Biden Biden may have been, by the way, the only candidate who could have beaten Trump. Again, I don't know, but you try to match the others up, and you say, you know, one thing Biden was able to do, and we'll talk about this in a minute about how really close this thing was able to edge in the suburbs and in the outlying rural districts just enough extra votes to put him over the top in some of those key, incredibly close states. And I don't know that another Democratic candidate would have been able to do that.
Yes. How would you assess how the two campaigns adapted to running election contests during a pandemic?
Well, they were.
I mean, it was a unique opportunity.
It was night and day. I mean, the Biden campaign was clearly committed to running a safe campaign in the most elementary sense. You know, they were not going to draw crowds. They were not going to campaign on rope lines. They were not going to take any risks. And the Trump campaign essentially said, no, we're going to have these rallies. We're going to have these mass gatherings. We don't really think the mask thing is that significant. I think the Trump campaign was to some extent a reflection of how the Trump White House and the Trump administration regarded the pandemic. I mean, they thought it would go away. They thought we could open. You remember this? We'll open by Easter. We'll open by Memorial Day. It's a matter of choice. I think the Biden campaign looked at the public health parameters and said, "We're going to fit the campaign to those." Trump campaign going to run it, and we will deal with the public health issues as we see fit. I just saw somebody reprinted a June journal piece by Mike Pence saying, and he was in charge of the coronavirus task force, saying there will be no second surge. We're on our way. Well, you know, I think there was I also think the Biden campaign paid a price for what it did. The fact that they did not do a lot of door-to-door, get-out-the-vote operations probably hurt them a bit. But they just weren't going to do that. I think they thought that given what Biden was saying about the coronavirus, it would be absolute hypocrisy for them to send out campaign workers to go knock on doors. So they were, and it's still very different. And Biden is now talking about a virtual inaugural. It's going to, you know, no parade, no balls. I've been thinking about what it's going to look like if the inaugural platform is filled with people, you know, 10 feet apart wearing masks. I mean, that's not ideally how you want to begin an administration. And Trump just went down to Valdosta, Georgia, and, you know, and nobody was wearing masks, and thousands of people were rallying behind, you know, his campaign to, I guess, elect 2 senators from Georgia and somehow get the election overturned.
Jeff, we had a pretty unique week in this election. I'm just curious how you think it stacks up historically. Near the end of September, the president had a week where, one, the New York Times basically described his financial situation as being far different than many people thought. 2, he had that really, really bad first debate. 3, his former campaign manager had that meltdown down in Florida, and then the president tests positive for COVID-19. Have you ever had recall an incumbent having such a bad week?
I can't recall an incumbent having, a year's worth of bad news compressed. And you know what? Take each of them, and the impacts were marginal. And this is one of the more remarkable things about this president, and we're seeing it play out today. I think once the New York Times got hold of Trump's tax returns and said he paid $750 in 2 years, I thought, well, okay, that's going to strike right at the heart of the white working class voter. Because if there's one thing that voter believes with good merit, it's that they are getting screwed, you should pardon the expression, while folks at the top sail through. You may remember, I'm dating myself, but in 1976, Senator Bill Brock lost a Senate race after he had to reveal that he'd paid very little in taxes. And all over Tennessee, people were wearing buttons saying, I paid more taxes than Bill Brock. And it killed him politically. Trump, I don't think it had any impact on on that core base of support. I would have thought that that first debate might have been some marginal voters that I'm not sure this is the kind of stability we want, or lack of it, in a president. Might have hurt him a little bit marginally. And as I say, when you look at how this race really came down, where it came down to, that might have been enough, but it certainly didn't have the impact that I think would have had on almost any other politician, because I think Donald Trump's connection to his base and to his party is unique. I think we're seeing this today. You've got United States senators. Oh, I know the one that proves this. Washington Post polled every Republican member of the House and Senate. Who won the election? 27 said Biden, 2 said Trump, and 200 and whatever the number is said, I don't know. I don't know. Because why? Because Trump has said, it was a fraud, it was rigged, the ballots were printed in some foreign country. And his hold on the party is so strong that either out of devotion, fear, whatever, the base of his party, including high elected officials by and large, are not saying, no, you lost. I've never seen anything like this.
Yeah. What's your analysis of why he has such an immense appeal to his base?
There are somewhere between those published and those commented, there'll probably be about, 1,000 books trying to figure this out. So the simplest way, and it's probably not a fully, filled out notion, is he has managed to connect with people by expressing grievances that somehow meet theirs. I think the idea that by and large, many of his supporters feel threatened or left behind by the changes in everything from the economy to the culture. I certainly heard all through 2016 and before, very early when he started running, he says what I can't. Now, some of that is very ugly, because I don't have any doubt that some of these people are responding to dog whistles, or in Trump's case, foghorns, about those people who are going to be moving into your suburban neighborhoods because Cory Booker's going to get in there. I mean, is anybody really dubious about what he's talking about? But it's also that kind of populist resentment that we've seen now all over the world. It's not just here. We've seen it in the rise of the populist right in everywhere from Poland to Hungary to Turkey to Italy. I think Marie Le Pen is going to be a formidable threat in France next presidential election. This feeling of being left behind and looking for someone who will fight for us tooth and nail, won't fight by the Marquis of Queensberry rules either. The very fact that Trump, I think early on in his ascension, I remember saying on Meet the Press, what a lot of us think is a bug is a feature for Trump. The very vulgarity, the very willingness to call names, the very willingness to flaunt his wealth. Most rich people in American politics kind of want to downplay that. And I think for a lot of his supporters, if I had his money, that's what I'd do. I'd have the private jet. I'd have the gold-plated toilets. I'd have the trophy wife or whatever. I think he connects at that level. And then you've got a whole other group of people for whom he's done what they wanted. The evangelical right. A lot of people say, how could they possibly support him after the Access Hollywood tape or the revelations about paying off someone he had an affair with? Well, he promised to get them a conservative Supreme Court and a conservative federal judiciary, and he did. And I think for a certain class of those at the very top, he's put a lot more money in their pockets. And the tax cuts also, while I think they disproportionately went to the richest, also did provide some extra money for the middle class. So there are both rational, traditional reasons to support him, and then this whole other factor. Put them together. Look, he did not suffer a crushing defeat. He lost by the final numbers were out. The popular vote spread was about 4.5 points, 7 million votes, but that's because there was a huge turnout. He got his vote out. Biden got his vote out. And I think the notion that he was going to lose by double digits and there'd be this crushing electoral defeat, I think that just was a mismeasure of what was going on.
So you clearly weren't surprised by how close the outcome was. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on why Republicans did so well down ballot.
Well, first of all, I was like many other people in this craft. By the time all the polls came out, I thought he would not do as well state by state. The polls were showing very close or even margins for Biden in Florida, in Texas even. So I got, I'm as big a sucker, is that the right word? Victim. So yeah, I was surprised. But and before we go on, there's one thing that really needs to be underlined, because when you measure it one way, Biden won big, 7 million votes. When you measure it another way, he won an impressive spread in the popular vote, about where, better than Obama did the second time, about where Clinton was on George H.W. Bush. Less than Obama the first time, less than Clinton running against Bob Dole. But everyone 4 years ago was fascinated by the fact that 77,000 votes in 3 states made the difference. Well, this time, a combined total of 45,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and I think Arizona. I think that's right. If those 3 states had flipped, and you're talking about each of those states were won by like fractions of 1%. If those 3 states had flipped, the result would have been a 269 to 269 tie. And the election would have been thrown into the House of Representatives, where the Republicans have, I think, 1 or 2 more state delegations than Democrats, and Trump would have won. So that's one thing. I think the reason why the Democrats did badly was, where they did badly were in states that had been essentially red states. That is, they didn't win any of the Senate seats in red states. Not in, despite that they didn't win in South Carolina, they didn't win in Montana. They won only in Colorado and Arizona, and then they lost the Doug Jones seat. So basically, it goes back to what I said a little before. The Republicans stayed Republican. It wasn't that the Republicans unseated a lot of Democratic incumbents. They only came close in Michigan. But the Republicans stayed Republican. And on the state legislative level, where Democrats had hoped to make big inroads in Texas and I think Ohio, North Carolina. I may have these states a little bollocks. They didn't at all. Now, as you probably know, there was a very contentious conference call among Democrats in the House a couple of weeks ago. Big fights about centrist Democrats saying to the progressives, you know, they hear defund the police out here. They hear that you're a democratic socialist. And Jim Clyburn said, defund the police. When people hear that, they hear burn, baby, burn. I think one of the things, by the way, that happened in some of those swing districts that Republicans won back was the images on TV of the violence that happened in some cities after the George Floyd thing had a big impact. The coverage, one of the things that I still can't get through my head is CNN had a reporter and the Chiron said, mostly peaceful protests, and he was standing in front of a burning building. And I think people got that message. I think you know, some of the gains that Republicans made among Latinos, not just in Florida but in Texas and in other states, happened in part because when some of those folks hear socialism, they don't hear Denmark. They hear Venezuela and Cuba. And I think that happened. I think that among Black men, Trump did marginally better. And I think that's because, as one smart Democratic analyst said, the beliefs of Black working class men and white working class men may not be as far apart as their race suggests. So I think you had a lot of different factors. But clearly, one thing we've learned, and you could almost take encouragement from this as a civic matter, is you can have tons more money than your opponent, but if your message isn't getting across, it's not going to work.
Did you feel the president-elect received a mandate?
Let me take a second on this because it's a really significant question. It always pops up. When John Kennedy won in 1960, his popular vote margin was 0.1%, maybe. Nobody really knows. And he had very narrow electoral vote victories in some key states. In fact, there are people who still think that Illinois was stolen by Mayor Dole. And so there's a big question about, well, does he have a mandate? The first two people he appointed were Allen Dulles to stay at the CIA and J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, which suggested that he felt the need to shore up his base. But you know, as somebody once said, you go through elections where, say, 11,000 votes the other way in Ohio and Mississippi, and Jerry Ford beats Jimmy Carter. 537 votes out of 6 million in Florida, and Al Gore is the president, right? 77,000 votes the other way in 2016, and Hillary's president. But as somebody said, you know, they don't shoot off a 16-gun salute just because you had a close election. It's still a 21-gun salute. They play all the notes and hail to the chief, and all the nuclear codes are in your control. So, he's the president. Now, he has a particular problem in that he probably will not have a Democratic Senate, depending on the runoff. He has his margin in the House looks now to be about 5 votes. And just saw the numbers today, the overwhelming majority of Republicans think he's an illegitimate president. And so what I think that means is that for the Republicans in Congress, who I think feel either loyal to or trapped by Trump, he's not going to have much of a honeymoon. I think he's going to have a hell of a time getting a lot of those cabinet members confirmed. I think the idea of any kind of ambitious legislation, even with a 50-50 Senate, is dubious. You got a senator like West Virginia's Joe Manchin saying, I'm not for ending the filibuster. I don't want to pack the court. And I'm not sure I want to spend a whole lot of money. So he had, the unique set of circumstances. Just finishing a piece now where I argue that except for Lincoln, Biden may have the toughest road of any incoming president. When you add the pandemic, the economic consequences that are not going to be fixed for months, a politically dicey Congress, and the overwhelming conviction of the other party that this guy doesn't belong there, didn't, cheated his way in. And you're going to have a fellow named Trump, who I think is not going away, who may be launching his bid for the presidency on Inauguration Day. It's going to be very tough, particularly in these opening months for Biden. What he could possibly look forward to is this: if the vaccines and people take them, and the pandemic begins to really fade by the summer, I think you're going to see an explosion of economic activity, the whole return to normal, that could turn the whole sense of what the public feels around. That's what I think is his hope.
Obviously, a large part of what happens when the president takes office is going to depend upon the runoffs, the 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia. What's your assessment of those at this point?
Here's a good example where a certain sense of appropriate modesty prevails. The only thing I know about the history of runoffs is that it's tougher for Democrats to win, because the low propensity voters, who tend to be poorer, more minority, tend not to show up. So that I think there have been 7 runoffs in Georgia for various jobs, and the Democrats have won once. Now, what could be different this time is that the same Biden voters who turned out in the suburbs and even in some of the outlying areas of Georgia, not in Atlanta, the conviction of Republicans, all those African-American votes did it. It wasn't that in Georgia. It was suburban voters and even exurban voters in places like Gwinnett County and outlying Fulton County, and college-educated voters. They may change the dynamic. It is possible this time that they will turn out as voters who help put Joe Biden in the White House and don't want to see him essentially without any power. But I still think, if somebody put the proverbial gun to my head and said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to bet the house, I don't think the Democrats can pull off two of those votes. I will say, I watched the Kelly Loeffler debate, Warnock debate. I have watched pretty much every debate. I'm a debate freak. I love watching even the lieutenant governor's race in Nebraska. I've seen a lot of debates. I have never seen a more robotic candidate than Senator Loeffler. It was a Saturday Night Live sketch. Do you think that the senators should be allowed to trade stocks? I believe in living the American dream, and I'm running against radical liberal Warnock. But I don't know, I don't know whether or not a voter otherwise disposed to vote for her is going to say, oh man, I don't want that I don't want her in the Senate, because the other side is I don't want to underwrite a radical agenda in the Senate, and this is the way we protect ourselves from President Biden. I think the odds go with the Republicans win at least one of those 2 seats. But one of the things I think that really helped after Trump's election, I really think there's a real validity to a strong sense of humility and caution about saying, I think I know what's going to happen. I just think we get hit over the head so often with a surprise and a stunning shock. Well, maybe we just shouldn't assume. The fallacy of linear extrapolation is the idea that what has happened is going to happen in a straight line. Under that theory, by 2000, New York should have been neck deep in horse droppings because nobody pictured the car. Well, that's not how politics works. It doesn't work any more than life does. That, I see, it's subtly predictable, that's what's going to happen. So one thing I do think, Bill, we all should have gone down to Georgia and bought a whole bunch of radio and TV stations. Because they're spending $300 million. You know, I said that election night, I said, you know, damn, I don't have the resources to go down, but boy, I would have bought up every radio and TV station I could find in Georgia. And then just, you know, bought my own private island on the advertising revenue.
Right, right. Do you think, what are the odds of a rematch occurring in 24, Jeff?
So yeah, I just told you I don't know what's going to happen, and now you want to tell me what's happening in 4 years. Look, I think they're better than most. I mean, you know, the worst thing in the world is to believe polls taken right after this election about the next one, because it's always a matter of name ID. After 2000, the front runner in the Democratic Party was Joe Lieberman because he'd run as vice president. This is different. Because Trump has a death grip on the party. There was I just saw this story today, that somebody had signed, I think it was a congresswoman, signed on to the appeal that let's get this overturned. And she said, if I hadn't signed this, my house would have been bombed tonight. And Senator Ron Johnson the other day, in what he thought was a private conversation, said, of course I know the election is over, but if I said so, it would destroy it would be political suicide. Now, when these people are prepared to say that in public, what I certainly think is that none of the Republican Party wannabes, Ted Cruz, Hawley, Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, none of them are going to lift a finger to enter this race unless or until Donald Trump says, I'm not running. I think he's got that much of a control of the party. And it's not in his interest to do that. If he wants to, you know, make money in speeches or get a huge book deal like everybody else is getting, it'll happen because he's seen as the potential front runner, if you will, for the party. Now, there's an awful lot that can happen in the next 4 years. Would it matter if he and his business firm are indicted by the Attorney General of the state of New York, or will his followers just see that as a witch hunt? If his business empire collapses, he owes $400 million, and Deutsche Bank apparently has decided, I think we've had enough of dealing with him. Would that make any difference? Certainly, you know, he is like Rasputin. You know, in the story that they tried to kill Rasputin 20 different ways, and they couldn't do it. They poisoned him. They tried to drown him. I'm not comparing Trump to Rasputin in that sense, but in the survival sense, he's already survived what would have destroyed 10 other candidates, starting with the attack on John McCain 5 years ago, right through the Access Hollywood, right through the impeachment, right through the tax returns. So I think right now you can't just say, well, it'll fade. As soon as he's not president anymore, they'll move on. I don't think that's where we are with Donald Trump.
What, Jeff, was your assessment of the two virtual conventions? First time we've ever seen anything quite like that.
Well, as I mentioned, as somebody who fell in love with politics at conventions, I have to admit that I thought that they may have proven the essential irrelevance of the traditional convention. I thought, you know, I like, now President Trump brought, you know, hundreds of people to the White House lawn to give his acceptance speech because he thrives on that kind of personal dynamic. But I don't think we lost a step. The only question I have about the end of the convention is, one of these days, maybe when my grandchildren are covering politics, there may be a contested convention. And at that point, I don't know how you do that without a real convention. You know, I mean, we always think I went back and did a piece about this. Every 4 years, people write, this is the year of the contested convention. They've been saying that every time forever. But if you don't have the mechanism in place, it'll be very tough to pull off a contested convention. Although maybe not. Maybe the delegates will just, you know, there won't be fistfights on the convention floor like there were in 1952 or the Democrats in '68. Maybe there is a way to do this. But I think when you think about the enormous financial and logistical energy spent on a convention, you've had your share of them, I've had mine. as far as I can tell, the only thing about the conventions that really will be a loss is it's a chance for me to see every 4 years a whole bunch of old friends and colleagues and have dinner on the network's tab and trade old stories. I have to admit that I learned something at the 16 convention in Cleveland, where I met with a bunch of longstanding Democratic working class guys who were telling me that all of their friends were going for Trump. And that was an important piece of information, but I could have learned that by going to Cleveland without a convention. So I think we may have seen the end of them.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of politics in the country and the two parties. Let's start with the Democrats. How do they manage the tension between the progressives on one side and the establishment on the other?
You've asked, what used to be the $64 question, and then the $64,000 question, and I guess now it's the $64 million question. There has to be, in my view, some way for the fundamental Democratic message to be focused on what it always has been when the party succeeds, and that is, we are the party of the ordinary man and woman. We want to make your lives better. We want to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think the dilemma is, how do you do that when identity politics has become so much more significant? We're seeing this today, literally today, with the cabinet nominees. Women are angry that Biden has put a black ex-general as the defense secretary instead of Michelle Flournoy, because we've never had a woman defense secretary. And the Latinos are furious that there weren't enough Latinos in the cabinet. And look, this is a part of what the Democratic Party has to manage. It is a much more diverse party than the Republicans. But issues like abortion, issues like identity politics, issues like gay rights, although that one, I must say, has become a much less hot button issue, because I think the country as a whole is much more comfortable about that than it was 10 years ago. But as I say, if visible voices in the Democratic Party are arguing defund the police and say, well, you have to understand what we mean by that. We mean reform the police. Well, no, if you mean reform the police, try saying we need to reform the police. And keep that focus, as Biden tried to, on the fundamental economic message. Because if you had told me when I first got interested in politics, the Democratic Party would overwhelmingly lose the votes of the white working class, I would have said, what country are you talking about? Go back to Andrew Jackson, for heaven's sakes. That's not who the Democratic Party is. That's to a large extent what they've become. And given how rural white voters are overrepresented in terms of their power in the Senate and the Electoral College, particularly in the Senate, if the Democrats can figure out a way to do what they used to do, they're in trouble. I mean, I have to say, let me just take another minute on this, because I think it's important. I did a piece for the Washington Post about this recently. All the complaints from the Democrats, the Senate's undemocratic, small d, it's biased. Well, it wasn't that long ago that Democrats had 2 Senate seats in North Dakota, 2 Senate seats in South Dakota, 2 Senate seats in Montana, 2 Senate seats in Indiana, right? Those states didn't suddenly become the home of rural white working class people. It's just that Democrats used to win those votes by a lot more than they are now. And I would think, after all the talk about the rampant economic inequality, and we've seen that play out with the pandemic dramatically, Democrats got to figure out a way to get back to the core message for which I used to think Democrats were all about.
Well, Republicans have a really big problem too, of course. Back before the last presidential election in 2016, the party needed to get younger and more diverse, and it got older and whiter. Where does the future of the Republican Party lie?
Well, the short-term question is, are they anything other than Donald Trump's party? because that's going to define in the short term who they are. It occurred to me, Bill, that since I'm talking to someone from the Dole Institute, one of the most striking lines I ever heard from a Republican was in the middle of Bob Dole's acceptance speech in 1996. He was referring to Clinton and his opponent, and then he stopped and he said, "And he's my opponent, not my enemy." Well, you take a look at where the country has come from, and particularly, I think it is asymmetric in that that Democrats have said terrible things about Republicans, but we've never had an incumbent president who, in the middle of a campaign, urged his attorney general to throw his opponent in jail. And that's a pretty dramatic notion. But I do think, having said that, you still need to remember that a plurality of white women still voted for Donald Trump, that he did better among Latinos and Black men, as I said, with the message that at first blush you would think, well, how do you win Latino votes when you're talking about, people from terrible countries and rapists and coming across the border, because there is no Latino vote. It's a much more complicated issue. But I do think that as long as Trump is the face and the voice of the Republican Party, the losses that he suffered in suburbia and among the college educated, which is a growing part of the electorate, I don't see how the Republican Party deals with that. I just think it's, Now, on the down ballot level, they can separate themselves. There were 4 seats in California that went Democratic in 2018, and the Republicans got them back this time. And California is a state where the Republican Party has been presumed dead for the last 20 years. These are younger elected officials. They're more diverse. So there may be a way on the down ballot side for the Republicans to do what you mentioned. But, Donald Trump's voice is pretty dominant right now. And as I say, the idea that, for instance, Larry Hogan, the very popular governor of Maryland, is thinking of running for president and has condemned Donald Trump's campaign tactics and his post-election efforts to somehow keep the election. The idea that kind of Republican is going to have a foothold in the Republican Party anytime soon, I think, is a fantasy.
When you and I first got started in politics, Jeff, there were swing voters. You had landslide elections one way or another in presidential years. Today, we see this period of hyper-partisanship. How did it get this way? And do we have anything, any reason to be optimistic about it changing in the future?
I don't think the partisanship you're talking about is capable of changing anytime soon. It's quite striking. Go back to 1976, and don't hold me to these exact numbers, but roughly a quarter of Democrats voted for Jerry Ford and a quarter of Republicans voted for Jimmy Carter. And I think what's happened is that increasingly the parties have become tribal, in the sense that you either join these people or you're the enemy. Back, I don't know, some decades ago, the Pew Research Center asked what they thought, I think, was a whimsical question: would you be unhappy if one of your children married somebody from another political party? And basically 5% of Republicans and 5% of Democrats said, yeah, I'd be unhappy. The last number I saw was like close to 40% of each party would be really upset if their son or daughter married somebody from the other party. So what you've got here, and the surveys show this too, is people used to think the other party was wrong. Now they think the other party is evil. That Bob Dole quote, nobody's going to get up and say that at a party anymore, because they do see it as the enemy. And I think, I also think that the partisanship with which people receive their information makes that tougher. It's quite striking that just recently Fox News has lost a fair chunk of its audience Newsmax and the OAN network because the Trump supporters thought Fox was insufficiently supportive of Trump's argument that the election had been stolen. Now, when I have to say, when Fox News is seen as too unkind to Donald Trump because some of their reporters are saying, I'm sorry, but we can't find this evidence. Oh, you can't? Well, let me turn to somebody who can. And I think the same is true. We haven't seen it to quite that extent, but when people turn on CNN or MSNBC, they're turning it on because they're going to get, to some extent, and CNN has become really significantly different over the last year or two. They're seeing the reaffirmation of what they believe about the president and about the election. So I don't know how we're supposed to move to a situation where more Americans turn to a relatively dispassionate or objective source. Objective is a tricky word, but fair-minded. I don't think anybody will turn on CBS to hear an anchor saying, as Walter Cronkite used to do, that's the way it is. So I spent most of my life being relatively optimistic about American politics. I'm not in the short term. I think we're in for a tough time. I think all that people can do who despair of this is not be part of it. It's not inconceivable to me that Biden could make some progress in reaching out to the voters that didn't vote for him. But that requires not just town meetings and nice words. It requires programs that actually make a difference. At the risk of sounding, too sort of radical, there are pretty powerful forces in this country who like things pretty much the way they are, in terms of who gets what. And so the idea of, for instance, the idea of Republicans and join Biden, that's tough. I will say this, that there are some in the Republican Party, Josh Hawley of Missouri, who is another presidential hopeful, I think. They've been talking a lot about, we've got to be, this inequality issue is serious. We can't just be the handmaiden of the Chamber of Commerce and, the hedge fund boys. But whether or not he or any other Republican would join Biden in an effort to turn that around, I don't see that happening.
Jeff, when you got into politics, there were 3 television networks. People actually read newspapers. Money was critically important in campaigns. TV ads were absolutely critical. And today we've got cable 24/7 cable TV. We've got social media. We saw in this last election that the number of dollars you spend running the most TV ads didn't necessarily do the trick. Kind of assess this change that we've seen in our lifetimes and thoughts about where we go from here.
The first thing to say is that the inability of mass sums of money to move voters does not seem to have had much impact since, as we mentioned, there's going to be about $300 million being poured into Georgia in the next several weeks. What you're talking about to some extent is the unraveling of central sources of trusted information. You go back to the dawn of the Republic, newspapers were wholly owned subsidiaries of political parties. There was a Federalist newspaper that told you that Thomas Jefferson was the agent of Satan, quite literally. And you had Democrat, Republican newspapers that told you that John Adams was the servant of the King of England, literally. And then, over time, when you and I were younger and just starting, you basically had, newspapers and TV networks that tried to speak to everybody. And so they had that kind of voice from nowhere in terms of the authority. The Associated Press grew and prospered because they were serving newspapers of every stripe, and they had to be kind of down the middle. To an increasing extent, and not just cable networks, but think about social media. The key thing, I'm rambling here, but this is the key thing. There are no gatekeepers anymore. There was a time when kind of baseless rumors would never see the light of day because they wouldn't be on ABC, CBS, or NBC. They wouldn't be in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or on the AP wires. And there was no other place to go for news. You know, when the evening news was over at 7 o'clock or 6, whatever time, the next piece of news you got was your morning paper. You know, there wasn't this fire hose of stuff. And there was nobody to say, as Facebook and Twitter are trying to do now, no, this is false. You see all this effort now, the social media, the text to label information, but it is like a file. You know, shut this one, the other one again. So I don't know how many millions of people believe the most outlandish kind of sort of one. I guess it might have been Steve Bannon, who said that these ballots came here on boats from North Korea, the phony ballots. Well, I as a journalist, you look at it and you go, well, if that information, if that's what it is, can get distributed to, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people, what's the old line that a lie goes halfway around the world before truth puts its pants on? I mean, we're in that kind of situation now. And I know at a lot of universities, there's talk about teaching media literacy, but that seems to me like a pretty tricky prospect, considering how easy it is to just with one click of your mouse, find information from anywhere about anything. What is it that one of the Trump lawyers saying that the Obamas created the virus in a lab in Wuhan? All right, now, can I, is that the sort of thing, well, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Or, you know, we're not in a world anymore where the overwhelming majority of people of whatever political position think, wait a second, this is just nuts. So just have to keep your head above water, you know. Institutions like yours just have to keep getting out the word and trying to teach people as well as you can and we can that just try not to be victims of this kind of, it is poison, you know, it is. It's a noxious poison that's easy. I will say this, and I want to say, well, that's just your fake news liberalism. I think the fact that the President of the United States has spent 4 years calling the press the enemy of the people is not helpful.
Jeff Greenfield, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fascinating listening to you, and really appreciate your participating in our virtual post-election conference.
It was a pleasure. I appreciate the quality of the questions and the chance to actually have a discourse about this, you know. It's what got me into this in the first place. I mean, you know, whatever else it has been for me for the last century, you know, and I think, my God, I could have been a lawyer. I made a good deal with the fates. So, and thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody who has joined us today for this conversation with Jeff. And I want to thank you for your support of the Dole Institute, and appreciate everything that you do to help us, and keep tuning in to our post-election conference in the future. Thank you very much for joining us today.